Okay, welcome to the second part of this here. So what we're going to do is just talk about C Sharp in general, not necessarily regarding Unity per se. We will talk about using code in Unity, but right now I just want to get you familiar with the language itself. Okay, so if you're not already familiar with programming or whatnot, that's okay. I'm going to just start from the ground up. So essentially, whenever we're doing things with code or games or anything really, essentially, all of those things start with what we call data types. So, for example, if I wanted to create a name or an age or some other kind of data, we need some way to store that data. So, this is where types and variables come in. So, we have a variable, and I'm gonna explain. So, I'm gonna create a string, and I'm gonna call it name, and I'll explain in just a moment what you're saying. So we have a string. String is just a fancy word for text. So I declare the type of variable or storage box I want to create. This is basically going to just contain something. And I just named it name because it's very descriptive. So I'm just going to say Alex. All right. I'm going to have another string. And I'm just going to call it ability. And anytime we have a string or a piece of text, essentially we need to surround it with these double quotes. And anytime we have a statement in our program, we just have to end it with these semicolons. So it's very important. If you forget a semicolon, you could essentially break your whole game. So don't forget the semicolons. Okay, so those are strings or text. We also have integers, and I'm going to actually say age. And age, you know what? I'm not going to use age because I won't talk about that. We're actually going to just use the concept of speed. So I'm going to say speed is 10. I'll say int health equals 100. And notice these are all whole numbers. So a whole number is an integer. If it was going to be something like 0.0, we can't do that. You notice we get a red squiggly. So if you wanted to do a decimal value, those are what we call floats. So a float could be, I'll say power equals 20.2. And then we also need to indicate the little f. So that it just says that this is a floating type number. So floating type numbers, even though the name float sounds very confusing, all it just means is decimal value. Um, Now all these types in memory and whatnot at the lowest level essentially is binary and memory. So a float essentially has a number of bytes, but a double essentially is the same thing with just the double amount of bytes. So I could just say, I don't know. And this is going to be 20.2. Same thing, I just don't need to declare with an F. So not that important. Most of the time we work with floats anyways, so you'll customly see this F at the end of these. Anyways, we have speed, health, and power. So those are data types, right? We can do things with our types. We have these types that we store things in them, and all we need to do is just make sure we declare what they are. So, and you can name them whatever you want. I named them ability, speed, health, power. Pretty simple. Okay. Now, let's say I want to print all this to the console. So I'm going to just say console.writeLine, and I want to say name. If I run this program, it's going to take a moment here. It's taking a while to compile. But look at that. I got name Alex. Okay. I'm going to do the same thing with my other things. So not only name, but ability. Anytime you see this plus, it just means that we have this piece of text and we want to add this text also. So it's just going to merge it together as one piece of text. All right, so we got ability, and then I'm gonna actually do health first, because that makes more sense to me. Right, then we have our speed. And power. Okay, so you'll notice that these essentially correspond to the names right here. So if I save this and I run this, we'll notice that it prints out everything about my player or whatever I have. Okay, so in general, for like just a console program we're writing, we can use console.writeline. In Unity, we're going to do debug.log. It'll say debug.log. So just keep that in mind. Okay, now let's say we have our program here, and what happens when, let's just say at the beginning of the game, I want to print out all my player stats. So I print them right here, and let's just pretend that our game ended somewhere else in our code, and I want to print it again. Well, that's really inconvenient to have to write this or even copy and paste this every single time I want to use it, right? So let's just say I ran my game, I copied it 3 times. Okay, so let's just say pretend that printed at the beginning, we did it again somewhere in the middle, and then at the end again. Okay, that's really inconvenient though, because what if we have tons of code and we accidentally type something wrong, or maybe later we change this and we say power up, and it's not power anymore, it's power up. Well, look, now I have to update all these variables to power up if I want it to be correct. So there's a better way to do this. We can use a concept called a function. What's a function? A function is just a box that contains code. It's like a mini program for our program. I'll show you. So I'll say void, and then I'm going to call it print player stats. Parentheses, and these little curly braces. I'm going to take all of this, I'm going to move it inside of it. I'm also going to hit tab so that we know that anything tabbed in here is inside of our function. So what is this doing? Well, we've defined kind of a container to hold our code. Now, if I run my program, I'm going to run it, nothing happens. Nothing gets displayed. That's because we've only defined what will happen. If we want to actually call or use it, we have to just call print player stats like this. So I'm going to save. I'm going to run this. And look at that. There's my stats. Now, this runs from top to bottom. So our code gets read from top to bottom. So if I wanted to do this again, like I did earlier 3 times, I'll just use print player stats 3 times. Run my program. Boom. 3 times we see this output. So this is a really clean way and a clever way to avoid repeating ourselves. Okay. So we discussed types, data types, things that we can store. We discussed functions, basically a container that holds code that we want to repeat, maybe over and over. Okay, now aside from functions, I'm going to print my player stats just once. Aside from just these functions, what happens if our player maybe dies? Because we have health, but we know that health can decrease, right? So if our health decreases, we should have something that kind of tracks that and does something if our health goes to 0 or less. So we can do that in our game. Let's just pretend that this is our game. This is not a game yet, but we're just basically going over these basic concepts of how code works. So we have these if conditions, and an if condition is just like a real question in real life. So if something happens, do something, or else do something else. So I'll say if our health is less than, if it's less than or equal to 0, then I want to console.writeLine player died. Else, otherwise, essentially else just means otherwise, I want to write to the console, player is still alive. All right. So we have conditions now in our code. Basically, we have conditional logic, right? We can check if something is true or not, and we can change how our program runs depending on conditions. We don't have to do health. We could even do something outside simply, for example, I'll say integer temp outside. The temp equals 70. And we'll say if the temp is greater than 90, then I want a console.write it's hot outside. Then I'll say else if, see, I can have another condition now. Or else if the temperature is less than 20, well then I want a console.writeLine it's freezing out. Now, if it's not greater than 90 and it's not less than 20, we can have a default. So I'll say if this is false, else if this is false, then we'll just do this. We're going to console.writeLine. It's just perfect out. So those are conditions, and we can change the output of our program depending on this value. So I'm going to run this program, and we'll see what it says. Where'd it go? Oh, right here. It's just perfect out. It might help to see it if I comment that out. So I'm going to run it again real quick. Console.write. Okay, it's just perfect out. I'm going to increase this to 95 and run my program again. And look at that. It's hot outside. So we changed our program. The outcome of our program changed depending on our value here. So those are conditions. Okay. Those are conditions. We're going to be using those all the time. We're going to be using functions all the time. And yeah, what we will discuss a little bit now too is something called a class. It's not our class, it's a type. So just like we have types like string, integer, a float, we have classes. Oh, I also forgot the Boolean. Boolean is a true or false statement. I forgot to mention this. We could have is alive equal true. We could even use that later on. We could say if not is alive. So this exclamation point means not. So if we're not alive, then I'm going to set our health back to 100. Right? So if our health is if we're not alive, or we could say if our health is less than or equal to 0, like we did earlier, we should probably reset it, right? So health less than or equal to 0, health equals 100, and we might even want to respawn. Respawn. We don't have that yet. So why don't we do that? I'll make a function called respawn that can contain all of this logic here. So what happens when we respawn our player? Well, is alive is true, and health needs to be reset to 100. So that essentially is functions. We'll talk about maybe classes in the next video or the next class. So